Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. As you guys can see, we are in the main bay right now, but we'll be heading outside shortly. And what we'll be working on today is, I may have a problem, I may not have a problem. I'm not really sure how severe it is, but basically what has happened is there is a sign that I have pump rub on my transfer case for the Duramax. Basically what happens is the back half of the transfer case, I believe it's made out of magnesium, and actually we have welded that in the past. This is the same material that the ZR1 subframe was on the Corvette. I'll have a link to that video up above. And basically what happens over time is the pump that's inside the transfer case literally rubs a hole through the case itself, that magnesium material, and that basically starts leaking onto the outside of the transfer case. Now I did go under the truck, and as you guys can see right here, there is some sign of some leakage, but if you guys could see above the passenger side of the case, there's no hole. That side of the transfer case is dry. So I'm not really sure what exactly is going on, but as you guys can see right here, the RTV that's sealing the two halves together is blown out. Now I don't know if this leak is just from that one little hole in the RTV on the bottom of the case, or there's another problem somewhere else in the transfer case. So if there is, I ended up picking up this Merchant Automotive pump rub fix is basically what this is called, and it's a billet aluminum hub that goes onto the pump itself. It replaces the stock aluminum one. So there's a bigger, I believe it's this bigger casing. It comes with this RTV silicone, and then there is some blue Loctite. And then actually on the back side of this, not that you guys can see, but there is a transmission gasket. So hopefully with this kit, I'm not sure if we're going to end up using this billet piece. You know, hopefully we can resolve this leak. It's not a huge leak. It's more of a seep that's kind of coming down and misting as the oil or transmission fluid comes out the back of the case. Now the flip side of that is that RTV is the wrong color. It's not the factory silver or black that I was expecting. It's orange. So that tells me someone has been in there in the history of this truck. So you guys are going to need a 11mm socket. You're going to have to take off the back bolts that connect the drive shaft to the rear axle. Once you take those 4 bolts out, you can basically pull the drive shaft forward and then remove the drive shaft from the transmission. The next thing we're going to need to do is actually remove the front drive shaft. So same thing, you've got 11mm bolts to use a ratchet wrench or a socket, whatever you decide to use. Take those 4 bolts out, and again, you're going to pull the front drive shaft from the differential. Now that we've got the drive shafts out, we got to work on the mount. So there's 6 bolts holding the transfer case to the transmission. You're going to pull those 6 nuts off. You're also going to want to remove the transmission mount because that's kind of in the way. You may have to remove the cross member below the transmission. Just not sure at this point. So you're going to have to support the transmission with like a 2x4 and a floor jack. And then you're also going to have to remove the electrical component. There is electrical connection on the side of the transfer case. Unplug that, and we should be good to go on getting this transfer case out. All right, guys, up to this point, you can see we got the cross member removed. That's right there. We got the transfer case drained. Basically what we're going after now is actually all the bolts that are connecting the transfer case to the transmission. So basically all those ones up there, and then you guys will see the trans to diff brace that we installed a while back. We got to take that off too, unfortunately. So we got to take all those bolts off. I did disconnect the electrical harness up top like we showed earlier, but besides that, there are a couple brackets and stuff that are actually in the bolts right here on the other side. We're going to disconnect that because one of them is actually, I think it's for the e-brake. And yeah, so there's a couple little stuff like that. We'll get all that disconnected. We'll get these bolts removed from the transfer case to the transmission. Get all that popped off, and we should be able to slide this thing back. Alright guys, about 3 hours later, and me being way more dirty than I was when we started this project, you guys can see we have the transfer case out of the truck. You guys can still see that I have the front drive shaft attached. I'll get back to that in a minute, but you do see we do have a drain pan. I probably drained, it says there's 2 quarts of transmission fluid in there. Well, that's actually what it is, it's ATF. Drained that as much as I could. We did spill a little bit on the driveway, but nothing too bad. And we also have our PPE brace that goes from the transfer case to the transmission. as well as the drive shaft and the cross member. So we took a lot of parts off to get this out, and I'm not sure I had to take everything off, but it just made more sense making room, getting stuff out of the way, and getting that cross member off. While yes, it did add maybe 20 minutes to the job because it was 4 bolts that are super tight. Just getting that out of the way, I was able to back the whole transfer case backwards and down, and it got it right out of the truck. As you guys saw, it was kind of a controlled fall. And we did use our transmission jack from Harbor Freight. That was good for lowering it, but because I didn't have the truck on blocks or, on jack stands or anything, I didn't have enough room to actually slide the transfer case out from underneath the frame. It was hitting the suspension cross member where those front torsions bars tie into, as well as the frame on the side. So if I had the truck jacked up, that might make it better. So what I ended up kind of doing is I just ended up lifting 1/4 at a time of our transfer case and doing a controlled fall off of that jack onto the ground. And then I kind of just stuck it underneath the tarp, and I was able to slide it out from underneath that. And we did get it out of the truck. And you will see it is on a furniture moving dolly that's from Harbor Freight too. But yeah, so it wasn't super difficult to get off. The one thing I had to do, which you guys might think is kind of brutal, I had to take a 15mm ratchet. This is actually from Harbor Freight as well. This is the old Pittsburgh brand. And I ended up having to cut it in half because I simply didn't have enough room to get this very top bolt. It was either this one or this one. I didn't have enough room trying to get a socket or any other tool on here to be able to bust this loose. So I kind of made a tool. And yes, I did kind of cut a tool in half, like I said. But you know what? It's a Harbor Freight tool. I don't care if I cut it up. I'll go ahead and buy a Craftsman because that's kind of what I'm subbing in, the parts I break. Order that on Amazon or whatever, and we'll get this to the house. So, but for putting the truck back together, we've got our tool. We don't have to weigh anything. Guys, I tried every socket combination I could think of. I tried, wrenches, extensions, sockets, my Milwaukee tools. I had nothing that could fit there. The one install guide that I saw, they did have these flex swivel head self-ratcheting wrenches like this. That would help if I had it, but obviously I don't have it. I'm in the middle of the project, and it was easier for me just to cut my tool in half than it was to get in the truck and try to go find one of those. I'm not even sure my local Lowe's, which carries Craftsman, I'm not even sure that they would actually have that. So, yeah, so you do with what you got, and, so we made a tool. And like I said, I think the replacement one from Craftsman will be, I don't know, $10, $12, something like that. So not a bigger deal. So we'll get that on order. All right, guys, you'll notice that I did get the front drive shaft off, and I ended up getting that off by cutting the rubber boot as well as using a screwdriver on the CV joint, boot clamp, if that's what you want to call it. The rubber boot is somewhere over here. There it is. I ended up cutting that down the middle of it just so that we could get it off. To get this front drive shaft out, it was actually stuck in the casing. So I used a little bit of heat. I used just a little propane torch as well as some WD-40. And I just heated it up a little bit, sprayed it with WD-40, heated it up, sprayed it with WD-40, hit a small hammer on the flange of the drive shaft. Not super hard, just hard enough to knock it loose. And finally we got it to where I could start to see the spline, and then eventually more and more the spline showed up, more and more and more. Again, a little bit more heat, a little bit more WD-40, and finally I was able to knock that loose. And what I'm working on now is actually taking all the bolts out of the case that holds the two halves together. These are a 10mm bolt, and you guys will see I have marked it, so you'll see 2 slots there, 2 dashes there, 1 dash here, 1 dash here. That's just to make sure all of our brackets line back up when we put this back together. Then there is this 15mm bolt right here. I'm going to put that back in place. And then on one of these ends, I had already taken 2 of the bolts out because those were actually the 2 bolts that this PPE brace goes through. It's going to be this end right here. So we were missing 2 bolts. I have them. Just that is something you should be aware of. So get all those bolts out. The next thing we're going to do is take this electrical connection out. I believe that's going to be a 19mm. And then you have the snap ring grommet. We got to pop that off, and then we're going to pop a snap ring off inside this case so that this top half will slide up. All right, guys, well, you can see we got the case split in half, and here is the front half of the case with all the gears in it, and here is the back half of the case. Now, the one thing I did discover, this doesn't have necessarily the Merchant Automotive pump rub fix. It does have this shim in here, which I have seen for sale on real cheap websites like Amazon and eBay. I mean, these are, I'd almost say a knockoff, and these are only like, I want to say these are only like $10 or $15. And I guess it's probably two ways of doing the same thing. So, you know, there's multiple ways to fix issues, but this is just a real small piece of what looks like stamped steel. This does have an OEM style hub on it, so I am going to end up getting rid of this and putting on the billet piece over there from Merchant Automotive. But to get the case off, I did want to show you guys the snap ring, and this is the snap ring that's inside the case. So I think that stays in there. I don't think that comes out. I mean, even if it did, you'd have trouble trying to get that out. So kind of like I was saying earlier, to get that, you had to take this access panel off, and once you get that off, put your snap ring pliers inside there, and then you push up on the sensor. So that sensor actually, I believe it lines up with this gear right here, and you push upward with a small screwdriver, not with a lot of pressure. You'll hear that snap ring loosen up, and that allowed the case to come upward. Now, the other thing you guys got to make sure is this main shaft, you do not want this to be supported. You want this to be free spinning. So if you guys look underneath our floor jack right here, this isn't under any pressure. So what I'm saying is, you don't want that to be elevated. You want that to be loose and separate. That way the shaft has room to move up and down, because I think that's what was key to get this case split in half. So, all right, guys, you can see we got the pump assembly out. We had to take out that snap lock ring like we were saying, and then the bearing and the gear, that all came out, slid out, no problem. Now we've got our T15 socket. We basically just got to get this loosened up, and we'll transfer this cover for that cover and put it back together. All right, so I did get the pump assembly taken apart, and this is basically just like an oil pump inside your engine. I'm kind of shocked to see that, but it makes sense. They use the same technology to pump oil through a transfer case or pump oil through a motor. So we're going to want to take off these two sprockets, put them inside the aluminum hub right there. So looking at the billet top and the OEM bottom, I think what we're going to do is, I think we're going to line up the two small triangles. That kind of looks like the way we're supposed to line these up. So there you go. You line that up. Do all the bolt holes line up? Yeah, they do. So yeah, so I think that's how you line it up. Kind of this witness mark. You've got a triangle on the top half, triangle on the bottom half, and line those two up. And we're going to put the factory bolts back in, but they did provide you some blue Loctite, and we'll use that blue thread locker, get that all together, and we'll be finally done with this pump rub upgrade. All right, guys, everything is tightened down. We do have blue thread locker on everything, and we just use our T15 and our adjustable screwdriver, put all that back together. Now this thing is ready to go back into the transfer case. All right, guys, we got the billet hub, everything assembled. We got the gear we told you about, we got the bearing we told you about. Then you guys can see the snap ring that we put back in. And yes, we're pretty much well on our way. All I gotta do now is put the top half of the transfer case back onto this. But we gotta get this cleaned up first. I'm gonna get some brake cleaner and a razor blade and just go over this and clear off all of the silicone. All right, guys, we did put a bead of silicone around. You actually will see that I went over it twice. The initial bead I did seemed pretty thin, so I have fully torqued down all of the bolts for the transfer case, those 27 foot-pounds. I put the sensor back in, put the grommet back in for the snap ring, and that's pretty much about it. And we did get all of the brackets lined up like we showed you earlier. 1, 1, 2, 2. And yeah, so now that the transfer case is fully back together, let's get it back in the truck. Alright, guys, we've got everything put back in the car. We got the transfer case put in. We got the rear drive shaft put back in. And that is connected down to the rear axle back there. So everything is good to go. All we gotta do now is put in the front drive shaft, and we've been waiting on some parts, and those just got here. Alright, guys, like we mentioned earlier, we were waiting for some parts, and those just got here. That is this boot kit. So that's part number 1247 1527. That's this rubber boot. It's supposed to come with these 2 clamps, but mine only came with 1, so I had to order a separate one, which is no big deal, but clamp part number is 26064275, and you're also going to need a pair of CV boot clamp pliers. They're just calling this a boot clamp pliers, but basically it's the same thing. It's going to be, you can take this clamp wherever the square head of it is, put it inside this tool, tighten that down, and you'll be able to get the clamp tightened down over this boot. So, all right, so I think the main thought here is to put the clamp around the boot itself. So you put that in, then you put the metal square, if that's what we're gonna call it, the head of the clamp. You're gonna put that in the boot clamp. Then you're simply just gonna squeeze the 2 ends of the wrench together, the tool together, and that will simply crush and should tighten up this boot clamp. So we're gonna do one on the axle side and then one on the transfer case side. All right, guys, we did get the front drive shaft in. As you guys can see, it is all hooked up and tightened down up front. Then here out back, we've got our new boot. We've got 1 clamp done. Actually, this clamp was actually missing on the OEM boot. So I think someone had been here at some point, but they didn't put the boot back on, or at least the clamp for it. So if you guys look at the clamp on the left, you can see that the head of it is kind of square shaped. If you guys look over here, that clamp is more rectangular shaped. That is because I've already tightened down this clamp. That Lyle tool that we bought worked mint. So, all right, guys, I just filled up the differential with this synthetic ATF. This is actually what I use in the Corvette transmission. So this should be fine. It's I think it's ATF 4, Dextron 3, 4. Yeah, this is fine. So this synthetic ATF is what I end up using. I do have some Transyn left over, but this is just way more easier to put in. So plus we had it on the shelf. So all right, guys, I just went on a test drive and everything ended up being fine. I did a test drive in 4-wheel low, 4-wheel high, everything front and reverse, going forward and backwards, and we didn't have any issues there. So I think we're pretty good. So hopefully this pump rub kit does its job, and we don't have any future problems with this transfer case, and the oil we put in, we should be fine there. So that's gonna be it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed it, hit that like button. If you guys want to see more truck content, hit that subscribe button, turn on your bell notifications. And if you guys want to help support the channel, check out the links down below. Should have links to that transmission fluid, the pump rub kit, and some of the tools that we used today, as well as the that boot that we had to buy, the clamps, as well as the Lyle tool. All that stuff worked out pretty well. So check out those links down below. Make sure you check out our website, BonecrrusherSS.com. We do have new Duramax merchandise on there, so go check that out. Thanks, guys. Have a great one.